and we have already voted.
Well, good. We actually, we were going to do it the first day, and then we did.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second in our series of Mansfield Dialogues for Fall 2020. My name is Deena Mansour. I'm the Executive Director of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center. This event is live on Zoom and on Facebook through both the Mansfield Center and Missoula Community Access Television. This event will be videotaped by MCAT as part of its media assistance grants programs to nonprofit organizations and available for future viewing. So it will be available on Facebook and also on MCAT. We had more than 200 people register today for what is clearly a hot topic, and we're honored to be joined by so many people across the world here in Montana, and including one of our Mansfield Advisory Board members, John Menson. So thank you for making time to join us. Some of you may be new to Zoom, so I'm just going to go over a few basic ground rules, even though I think a lot of us have had plenty of Zoom over the last few months. Please keep your sound muted throughout the dialogue. To have your screen show only the speaker, go up to the right-hand corner of your screen. It should say either speaker view or gallery view. If you click on speaker view, you'll have the speaker large in front of you rather than the 200 people joining us. We hope that tonight truly meets the definition of dialogue, and the best way to do that in electronic format is to have you engage via the chat box. So if you're not familiar with chat, if you move your mouse down to the bottom of the screen, a number of icons will appear. Toward the middle is the chat icon, and if you click on that, it will open up a box on the right hand of your screen. So we encourage you throughout this next hour or so to include your comments, to list your questions, and we'll get to those questions and comments toward the end of the presentation today. So before we get into the talk, we do have some exciting announcements. First, we have a transition here at the Mansfield Center. Dr. Dane Scott joined the Mansfield Center and the University of Montana in 2005 to run the Center for Ethics, restoring that work to its original home at the Mansfield Center in 2011. During his tenure at the University of Montana, Dane has been instrumental in leading major conferences on healthcare, as well as the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act, in addition to co-founding one of our primary programs here at the university, our Climate Change Studies program. After 15 years of administering the ethics program, Dane is shifting to focus on his work as a professor of ethics at the Franke College of Forestry and Conservation, as well as working with biologists to develop an ethical framework for evaluating new gene editing technologies for conservation. He will continue to teach the annual Mansfield Senior Seminar on Ethics and Public Policy. So I'd like to turn over the screen to Dane so that he can provide an interim opportunity to say a few words before we can celebrate him in person when that time arises. Dane?
Says I'm unable, no. Can you open my screen? Okay. Shows my age here.
There, I see you.
You see me, great. Oh, I just wanted to thank Deena, is so gracious and kind, and thank you for those words. And I really have enjoyed the Mansfield Center and the team in there. It's been a delightful place to work. And I couldn't be more excited for Deena in the future, in the post-pandemic world. I know the Mansfield Center will thrive under her leadership, and I could not be more excited about Rob joining the Mansfield Center. Rob just seems to really know what's important and the kinds of things to focus on. The very successful healthcare conference we had, that was with Rob, and also the 50th anniversary. And you know, as tonight's presentation and the book show, he really knows what's important to talk about. And so I think that the future of the Mansfield Center is really bright, and I couldn't be more excited.
Well, Dane, thank you. You have been instrumental in developing the ethics program. You know, if you drive around Missoula, there are banners everywhere that pronounce that the University of Montana helps you to live ethically. And I would say that Dane has been at the center of those efforts. So
Yeah.
thanks, Dane. And we look
Thank you,
forward to
Deena.
continuing to
Thank
work
you so
with you.
much.
So as Dane mentioned, I'm also excited to officially welcome tonight's speaker, Rob Saldin, as the new director of the Mansfield Ethics and Public Affairs program. Rob is a UM professor of political science and has been in that capacity since 2008. He previously served as a fellow in our ethics program before taking on the director position. As the founder of the Project on American Democracy and Citizenship, he is dedicated to fostering civic knowledge through the study of American politics, history, and public affairs. His work offers opportunities for UM students and our communities statewide to explore vital issues affecting democracy. In addition to being the author of 3 books, including the one we're going to be talking about today, Rob's work has appeared in numerous publications, including The Atlantic, The New York Times, The New Republic, and National Affairs. He has previously held appointments at Harvard, Johns Hopkins, UC Berkeley, and the Miller Center of Public Affairs. He holds a PhD from the University of Virginia. So I am thrilled to have Rob join us in the Mansfield Center leadership team. As UM and our nation seek to reinforce the importance of sustaining democracy, there is no better time for someone of Rob's expertise to lead this critical program to support Montanans and our region. So I'd like to turn it over to Rob now.
Well, thanks, Deena. I'm just so excited to step into this new position at the Mansfield Center. As Dane mentioned, you know, he and I have been working together for many years now, and have, among other things, put on those conferences and hosted dozens of speakers on campus, and most of that work was very directly focused on Dane's effort to reinvigorate the center's mandate to foster ethical public policy and leadership. So it's an honor for me to get to continue that work and to build on the foundation that Dane has established over the last decade or so. And to that end, I also have the distinct pleasure to announce another bit of news tonight. A more important bit of news, I would say, and that is that the Mansfield Center will be offering a new scholarship for UM students. We've had some anonymous donors step forward with a $50,000 gift that will endow a scholarship, and they wanted this scholarship to honor Bob and Sue Brown, who are longtime friends of the center, longtime friends of UM and the Montana University system as a whole. Bob and Sue are with us tonight. The scholarship in their honor is going to be known as the Bob and Sue Brown Undergraduate Scholarship for Ethics and Public Affairs. And it's going to award a total of $3,000 to 2 students every year who have authored an academic paper or a creative project that focuses.
Rob, I'm sorry, you've gotten muted somehow.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm not sure where I left off. I was just in the process of announcing this new scholarship for to honor our friends. Where did I get cut off, Deena?
Just about 20 seconds before I told you.
Okay, so I think I'll just go back to the beginning. Basically, we got a $50,000 gift to establish this endowed scholarship. It's to honor Bob and Sue Brown, who are longtime friends of the center, the University of Montana, the university system in Montana in general. They're with us tonight. The scholarship is going to be called the Bob and Sue Brown Undergraduate Scholarship for Ethics and Public Affairs. And it's going to award $3,000 to 2 outstanding students each year who have authored an academic paper or who have completed a creative project that focuses on a topic related to ethics and public affairs. And we're just especially proud that this scholarship is named in honor of Bob and Sue because they have led exemplary lives committed to public service. Sue is a lifelong educator, having taught at Flathead High School for 40 years. She chaired the English Language Arts department there, She was also instrumental in establishing the first international baccalaureate program in Montana, as well as numerous opportunities for students beyond the classroom. You know, everything from serving as speech and debate coach to running the close-up program. She's also led a number of statewide curriculum initiatives through the Office of Public Instruction. Bob is a well-known figure in Montana. He served in the state legislature for 26 years, including a stint as president of the Senate. In 2000, he was elected statewide as Montana's Secretary of State, and he was the Republican Party's nominee for governor in 2004. Bob, like Sue, taught for decades, in Bob's case, both at the high school level and the college level. And he's also been a senior fellow at the Mansfield Center and the O'Connor Center for the Rocky Mountain West here at UM. And he's also just, as I said, one of the best friends that UM and the university system have. Just to cite one thing, he was really one of the key people at the front of the 6 mil levy, which of course is just absolutely essential to what we do here at UM and across the university system. And beyond that, just speaking personally, he's someone I feel very lucky to have gotten to know during my time at UM. Anyone who knows Bob will back me up when I say he lives a life of integrity, of honesty, and of good cheer. So again, Deena and I are just thrilled to have this new endowed scholarship at the center that honors Bob and Sue. And I would like to turn it over to the two of them to say a few words if they would like.
Rob, thank you very much for your kind comments. And thank you also to Deena and Rob for their tireless leadership helping to make these endowed scholarships a reality. First, let me say how overwhelmed and touched Bob and I were when Deena contacted us about the establishment of these scholarships in our names. We are deeply humbled that these anonymous donors have chosen to honor our own commitments to public service in this way. Now, we desperately want to let these donors know our appreciation personally, but we also know that their desire to remain anonymous is just further evidence of their own selfless and lifelong contributions to ethics and public affairs. So please accept our thank you here. Now, while we don't consider ourselves worthy of these named scholarships, we are very excited that these generous donors have made this scholarship available to undergraduate students to promote the ideals of ethics and public affairs as students pursue their degrees and prepare to embark on their careers in any discipline. For ethics is so critically important in all disciplines. Both Bob and I find such hope in our younger generations who are energized and are reflective, much like our own daughters, Robin and Kelly, in whom we take great pride, and who have chosen to influence the future through their careers in education and their tireless involvement in public service and in public affairs. We strongly believe that the keys to solving the many social problems of our time and the existential challenges of our world lie with an educated, ethically minded, critically thinking citizenry. And we are excited that these scholarships, along with the ongoing work of the Mansfield Center and the Center for Ethics and Public Affairs programs, will help to promote that future. So please, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you.
Well, thank you, Sue. She's Sue and I'm Bob. And thank you also, Deena, Mansour, and Rob Saldin, and to the anonymous donors who have made these wonderful scholarships in our names possible. Sue has spoken for both of us, and her comments, as always typical of her, were beautifully articulate in saying exactly what needs to be said, and my comments will be very brief. Sue and I are both deep believers in the vital importance of education. Educated and thoughtful young people are inherently the future of humanity in every generation. The importance of that is especially true in this particularly challenging time in history. It is our devout hope that ethical civic leaders and policymakers of tomorrow will be among the recipients of these scholarships for many years to come. Thank you again to those who have endowed these awards and to the Mansfield Center for providing the stewardship necessary for carrying them forward. Rob, back to you.
And actually, I will just jump in. Bob and Sue, we are so honored to be able to host this scholarship in your names. And I will say that as our founding director, Paul Lauren, would attest, we have not, since we were founded by an act of Congress in 1983, had donors of this magnitude or had donors that wanted to focus so specifically on students. And to do that in your name is a great honor. So we felt that tonight's dialogue would be a wonderful opportunity to announce this scholarship. We have nearly 200 people who have joined us who maybe didn't bargain for such a wonderful introduction and opportunity to meet such two wonderful people of Montana, but we're so grateful to you for joining us. And you are going to be a continual reminder to our students and the people of Montana of all you've done in the best interest of civil society and our democracy. So thank you again.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Deena.
So I'm pleased now to turn this back over to Rob for tonight's presentation. As a reminder, we encourage dialogue. We want to see your comments and your questions throughout in the chat box in a civil way. And following Rob's formal presentation, I will draw from those comments and questions for Rob's response. So our program tonight will go until about 8 or 8:15 at the latest, depending on the number of questions. So again, here's the book. As moderator, I'm going to stay out of it, but I have many dog-eared pages and questions myself. I look forward to posing if given the opportunity. So Rob, thanks for joining us tonight, for sharing your expertise on an issue of such critical importance to the American experiment.
Yo, thanks, Deena, and appreciate so many people coming on for this. And at the risk of turning you all away, I'm going to play some political ads to start with, which I recognize is maybe not at the top of everyone's wish list here 3 weeks before the election as we're getting bombarded. But these, there's a rationale for this, and I'm going to subject you to a couple. This first one I want to play is from Ronald Reagan's 1984 re-election campaign. It's considered a classic, and it's one that I have been showing in my intro to American government class for years. Okay, here we go. This is Morning in America.
It's morning.
Rob, I'm not hearing any sound if there's supposed to be sound within.
Is the sound not coming through at all?
No.
Okay, well, we'll skip that. I'll just narrate it for you. Basically, 1984, there's this ad that comes out, Morning in America. You can find it on YouTube. And it's this feel-good ad. It's considered a classic. And for Republicans and conservatives, it came to symbolize what they consider to be the wildly successful Reagan years. And it's a phrase, Morning in America, that still is very much recognized in GOP circles. But earlier this year, there was a remake of this ad with a much darker tone, employing, among other things, a different spelling of the word morning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, That was put out by this organization called the Lincoln Project. And it basically told a tale using a lot of the same kind of language and setup and images that were in the original Morning in America ad back in 1984 to tell a very dystopian account of what life has been like under the Trump presidency. It's the kind of thing that would be fairly typical and that you would expect actually coming from the Biden campaign or from some Democratic super PAC. But the Lincoln Project is an organization that's comprised of some of the Republican Party's most accomplished campaign professionals, right? These are the kinds of people who ran the presidential campaigns for George W. Bush, for John McCain, for Mitt Romney, the professionals who sent countless GOP candidates across the country to Congress, into governor's mansions, and all the rest. Well, this Lincoln Project, and I do encourage you to go check out some of their ads if you haven't seen them already. They are, I think, some of the strongest ads of the cycle. And again, that's not surprising because these are some of the best people out there on the Republican side. But this whole Lincoln Project effort, it's just one of the latest initiatives by the so-called Never Trumpers to bring down their own party's president, which is a pretty remarkable thing. The book, which I co-authored with Steve Teles of Johns Hopkins, is about these folks, the Never Trumpers, the Republicans and conservatives who opposed Trump in the 2016 primaries, who opposed him in the general election, and who, in many cases, continue to oppose him today. The book is largely based on 80 plus in-depth interviews that we conducted with all the key players. And so I thought for today, I'd just say a few words about what drew us to the project originally, and then talk about some of our takeaways. And then would love to hear some questions. But one thing that drew us to the project is that the Never Trump phenomenon is so unprecedented. And that prompted the core question of the book, which is, why exactly did this set of dedicated partisans who've devoted their lives, in most cases, to the party, why did these people react to their own party's nominee, to their own party's president, in this unprecedented way? And it really was remarkable. There have been some historical parallels that we looked at, but they were never quite to the magnitude of this. Opposing your own party's nominee, it's just a big deal. And they went scorched earth. They pulled out all the stops. So they desperately tried back in the primaries in 2016 to coalesce behind an alternative in the primaries. Once they realized, too late, in fact, that Trump could possibly actually win the nomination. They also released letters of opposition to Trump that were signed by some of the party's A-list policy experts, the type of people who would normally be staffing the Republican administration. They orchestrated an entire barrage of critical opinion pieces in leading media outlets. Most notably, probably, was an entire issue of National Review, which is the leading conservative intellectual magazine. They dedicated a whole issue to attacking Trump at a very critical stage of the primary process. They also plotted to deny him the nomination on the floor of the Republican National Convention, right? So even on the very day that Trump accepted the nomination, they were still trying to deny it. And then finally, they recruited a third-party challenger to run for president in the hopes that the election would be thrown to the House of Representatives, or even to their longtime foe, Hillary Clinton. And that's a whole story in and of itself, including some near misses with top-tier candidates who quite possibly would have shaken up the race. But these activities that these people embarked on, they carried significant consequences. The people who engaged in Never Trump were people who were in line for political appointments in the next Republican administration. These were people who had made their living from inside that party, and whose ability to pay their mortgages in many instances was contingent on staying in the good graces of the party. These were people whose sense of identity, their professional identity, but also in many cases their personal identity, their social circles, and all the rest, was all tied up with being a Republican and a conservative. So for a lot of never-Trumpers, opposing the Republican nominee, it in some cases threatened their financial well-being. It ended up hurting their career trajectory. It was a jarring personal experience in many cases. There was a sense for many of them of feeling betrayed by their comrades in arms who they've been working with for decades, of finding themselves alone in the foxhole when they thought others would be with them. And many of them lost dear friends in the process. And in fact, the whole experience was so traumatic for some of them that we did have a number of interviews that almost turned into something closer to therapy sessions than a normal interview. But so all this is to say, this is not the way these things usually go. And this was all quite intriguing to Steve and I. And we tried to understand why some elite level Republicans and conservatives went never Trump, and why others in seemingly similar situations, why they looked at the same exact situation and were fine with it, and also considered these never Trumpers to have kind of gone hysterical. So we were interested in that. But the final launching point for this project that I think bears on a lot of work that the Mansfield Center was initially established to pursue. The final launching point had to do with the way Steve and I understand political parties and the role of political parties in liberal democracies. So liberal democracy, we think, it isn't some kind of default situation that will inevitably endure. And democracy has certain weaknesses, and these weaknesses can be exploited. And as such, democracy, it needs defenders. It requires certain institutional support structures. And political parties are one of these support structures. Or another way of saying it would be political parties are a critical mediating institution that helps maintain the health of liberal democracy. They provide some structure. They provide the guardrails that channel democracy in a positive direction, in a healthy direction, that filters out some of the pathologies that over the long course of human history have plagued and frequently destroyed democracies. So one of the reasons that Steve and I were drawn to the Never Trump phenomenon was because basically when we looked at 2016, we saw the effective collapse of one of these mediating institutions that supports a healthy democracy, right? Namely the Republican Party. So 4 years ago, elite level Republicans, they tried, but they failed to filter out a candidate who represented, in many respects, a rejection of the party's core principles, who embodied the kind of classical demagogue that the founders, among others, warned about. It was the type of scenario that the American party system itself was at least partially designed to avoid. Now, Never Trump was never a single thing. And it never centered really on elected officials. Right? There were some exceptions, Mitt Romney and a handful of other people who've mostly lost their jobs at this point. But the white hot core of Never Trump was found within networks of professionals within the Republican Party. So the policy experts who would normally be appointed to political positions at the State Department, at the Pentagon, the National Security Council, Treasury Department, the White House itself. It was with the political professionals who run Republican campaigns, including the folks who are now with the Lincoln Project. And it was with the kind of public intellectuals who formulate and disseminate the party's ideas and philosophies, right? Columnists like George Will at the Washington Post, and Jen Rubin also at the Post, and David Brooks and at the New York Times, and the Weekly Standard editor, Bill Kristol, right? And so we organize the book around these networks. And each of them has its own unique story to tell. The Foreign Policy Network, for instance, was the most cohesive of the groups. And in fact, they were very unforgiving for people who didn't join in with them. The political operatives, by contrast, they started out largely as never-Trumpers, but most of them had to start frantically deleting their anti-Trump tweets when it became clear that the party's nominee was going to be Trump. Now, right, and again, each of these little camps has its own story. But as political scientists, Steve and I are basically trained to look for structural explanations for political phenomena. And to be sure, we definitely found them in the Never Trump story. But it's also, I think, important here to probably emphasize that we'd be doing a disservice to the people that we talk to if we just chalked everything up to intra-group dynamics or economic considerations or the like. There was also a simple element of personal choice at work here. And as David Frum, who was a former Bush speechwriter, the guy who coined the phrase axis of evil after 9/11, he's now a staff writer at The Atlantic. As David Frum memorably put it, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, he probably put it more eloquently than I will, but he said basically, some people have a disgust reflex, and the line of separation between those who are able to swallow, or the line of separation is between the people who are able to swallow the toad and those who have not been able to swallow the toad. And there's something to that. But nonetheless, there are some characteristics that cut across the various subgroups that make up the Never Trump world. So let me spin out a few of those. So first, in 2016, the Never Trumpers thought that part of their role within the party was to serve that gatekeeping function that I was kind of talking about earlier, right? That it was their job, their responsibility as good Republicans, as good conservatives, to separate the clean from the unclean, to say who was a respectable Republican and who wasn't, to patrol the boundaries of respectable conservatism. And when Trump emerged as a serious candidate, they saw a threat to their understanding of what the GOP was, to what conservatism was, and more than that, they saw the kind of demagogic figure, the kind of popular leader who destroys democracies by dividing society to his personal benefit, playing on the very worst impulses out there in the mass citizenry. And in the past, the kind of gatekeeping effort that the Never Trumpers were trying to engage in, those efforts had largely succeeded. And in fact, conservatives have this whole narrative, this whole narrative of their movement's history, their way of understanding themselves, that basically consists of a series of successful purges, right? Of kicking out undesirable and unacceptable elements. And the classic example of this is William F. Buckley, the famed editor of National Review, kicking out the John Birch Society, right? Kicking him out of the conservative movement in the early 1960s. But there were other purges to cast out various racists and anti-Semites and so on. So the point is, though, that the idea of saving the party and saving the movement from a sinister outsider who was going to discredit everything that they'd worked for, that was very accessible for those people who went Never Trump. It was kind of built into their understanding of the party, of the movement's history, and of their role as people in good standing within the party. So when Trump came along, he appeared to them to just embody all of the non-respectable traits that they thought they had been effectively that they thought had already been effectively purged from the party, right? The crude populism, the demagoguery, the nativism, the race baiting, and so on. But there were probably a number of reasons you could cite, but one reason why a lot of that stuff had worked in the past, but it didn't work this time, is because we live in an era where the formal political parties, the formal party structures have grown significantly weaker. And in which the party's voters, for instance, rather than the party leaders, choose the nominees. And so their ability to filter out a toxic outsider, it obviously failed, right? And they found fewer areas of purchase that they could grab onto in that effort. And if you're a believer, as Steve and I are, in the important role that parties play in a liberal democracy, this is a concern, and a concern that has implications far beyond 2016 and 2020. So second, I think a second sort of overarching thing that you could point to is that those who went Never Trump were much more likely to have been involved with a major project within the Republican Party to diversify the party in the years leading up to 2016. So after this major disappointment of 2012, Romney loses to Obama. Republicans really thought they could defeat Obama. Well, there was a major push. It was called the autopsy, to look at where the problems were and what needed to be done to fix them. And for one significant group within the party, the conclusion of the autopsy was basically that, look, we need to reach out to minority voters and women. And we need to do this for a couple of reasons. One, there's just a moral imperative, right? It's the right thing to do. But there's also just a practical necessity that because the share of the white vote was declining and was projected to continue to decline, that we have to find new people to vote for us. Right, so as Mike Murphy, one of the party's celebrity consultants, put it, the white ship is sinking and we need to find some more people. So for those invested in that project of diversifying the party, Trump represented a couple things. One, he represented a repudiation of their professional assessment that the GOP had to diversify if it was ever going to win national election again, right? And the second thing he represented was a direct threat to all the work that they had spent several years engaged in trying to make the party appear more tolerant, more open to minorities. And they were mortified in watching Trump come along and happily do everything he could to turn off these groups that they had been working so hard to attract. A third overarching thing is that those who went Never Trump tended to have professional and financial flexibility that allowed them to do that. And this explains a lot of the difference, for instance, between the Foreign Policy Network, which hung together so tightly in the political operative world, right? So one of the things that characterizes the foreign policy experts is that these people have other sources of income. They have other professional outlets, right? They have gigs at think tanks and universities and magazines and so on. Now, to be sure, there were real costs, but these people had things to fall back on, right? These people were going to be able to make their mortgage payments, right? They might lose out on these professional appointments that were career highlights for people in this line of work, and career highlights that often lead to very lucrative opportunities after their time in government. But still, they had ways to pay their mortgage. That was not the case. That was not the case for the vast majority of political operatives. They don't have those kinds of things to fall back on. They can't return to their cushy think tank or their university or whatever it may be. The political operatives who held firm as Never Trumpers, which again ultimately wound up being a small minority of that network, for the most part, they had the financial flexibility to do so. They are older. They have made a lot of money running campaigns over many decades. They have a degree of fame that allows for opportunities for them to be pundits on cable TV and things like that. So in other words, they have a degree of financial flexibility to walk away. That's not an option for people lower down in the hierarchy who might, for instance, be working on Steve Daines's campaign or Greg Gianforte's campaign. For those people, if they went never Trump, that was it. They needed to find a new line of work because they would not be welcome again in GOP politics. And then finally, one other kind of overarching thing, and I wouldn't necessarily want to overemphasize this, but it was something that kind of really struck us, is that we do think there was a religious component to work at work in a number of cases. And that is to say that Jews and Mormons are way overrepresented in the Never Trump ranks. And, obviously there are plenty of non-Jewish and non-Mormon Never Trumpers, but we don't think it's a coincidence that these kind of two odd bedfellows are overrepresented in the Never Trump ranks. And our thinking on that is that what links these two groups is a history of what we call communal destruction. Clearly, the Holocaust is a well-known central touchstone for the Jewish community, but there's a similar shared and ritualized history in the Mormon experience dating back to the extermination order and Joseph Smith and the experience of being treated as fanatics and forced to relocate. So the point is that both groups have in their communal memory an awareness that things can go very badly very quickly, that a stable society is not inevitable. That's something we just found that people coming out of those communities were able to access very easily. And that's the framework through which many of them understood Trump's rise. And that came out very clearly in the interviews we conducted. And maybe just a brief word about a couple of these to illustrate the point, and then I want to turn it over to some questions. But there was one day in particular where this really, really stood out to us. And Steve and I were in New York, and we went to the New York Times building to interview Bret Stephens, a conservative columnist there. And he just immediately went to Hitler and the Nazis and all that. And he did it with the appropriate asterisks, like, well, we clear that this isn't literally Nazi Germany, but that was his framework for thinking about it, right? That's the first thing he went to, and he said, something to the effect of, this is the kind of thing that your grandmother warned you about, right? Well, 45 minutes, an hour later, we had gone over to the National Review headquarters and interviewed the editor there, a guy named Rich Lowry. And we kind of kept pushing, and Rich is just a very kind of waspy kind of guy. And we kept trying to push him on, can you see this going badly? And Rich was kind of in an unusual position. As I mentioned before, there had been that National Review episode that went, full on anti-Trump. They've definitely moved in a different direction since he became president. But Lowry just wouldn't quite go there. He couldn't quite understand how someone would think about it in those terms. And so, we had that experience a number of times, particularly with a lot of the intellectuals who were Jewish, who we talked to. That was just something that was right at the tip of the mind. So in any event, I could say a number of other things, but I think this might be, Deena, a reasonable time to turn it over to some questions.
Well, great. I think this is a great framework and a good perspective on your book. It's called Never Trump, the Revolt of the Conservative Elites. One continuing theme throughout the book is the maintenance of democracy and what the Trump administration means for that. So you talk about the maintenance of democracy depending upon certain norms of forbearance, in particular, a willingness to publicly recognize the legitimacy of one's opponents. Are there certain norms of forbearance that you see that are being violated now in reflecting on the current election cycle?
Well, sure. I mean, a number. The most obvious is the way in which the president and some of his supporters suggest that they might not respect the results of the election and the transfer of power should he lose. That's obviously a concern for democratic norms, absolutely. And you know, this is I think one of the challenges for American society, and to a degree for these people who've operated in the Never Trump space. There's, I think, a strong inclination among many of them to abandon the Republican Party, and many of them have. Not all, but many of them have. They've some of them have joined the Democratic Party. Some of them have just kind of recognized that they're going to be politically homeless for the foreseeable future. But again, to go back to our interview with David Frum, and I know this part made it into the book for sure. I was pressing him on this and why he chose to remain in the Republican Party, and I think he put it in a way that I think is worth giving some thought to. He said basically, look, it's not any good if we have a democratic system in which one of the two parties is committed to democracy, in which one of the two parties is committed to democratic norms, right? You need to have both of the parties committed to that. And I'm not going to leave the Republican Party. Frum says, you know, this is my home and this is where I'm needed. That's, I think, something that a lot of Republicans in the Never Trump space have struggled with over the last 4 years, and people come down in different places. But one of the concerns I have about the current situation is, and one of the criticisms we have of the Never Trumpers in the book, is that they really haven't done much to try to fight for the Republican Party, to try to think about the future of the party system and what their role will be in it. And we at least think that it is an area of concern, you know, because as Frum said, in a two-party system, you got to have both parties that share a certain commitment to democracy and to the norms of democracy.
Well, and your comments lead into two questions that we have. We have John saying, if Trump were to win another 4 years, what would you expect the Never Trumpers' reaction to be? And let me broaden that just more generally. What happens to the Never Trumpers after the election?
Well, they would be mortified, obviously, if he won another term. Many of them are working strongly against that. There's a Lincoln Project, obviously. There's this other organization called Republican Voters for Trump. I mean, there have been a number of initiatives undertaken by the Never Trumpers to try to do what they can through various channels, various mechanisms to push back against that. So they'd be just beyond horrified, especially given where we are right now. I mean, I think if it had looked for a long time and now like it was going to be super close and razor thin and could really go either way, they'd maybe be more prepared for a potential loss. But I think given where we are right now, you know, I was looking at 538 earlier today. I think Biden is up to something like a 90% chance to win, which is much better than Hillary was at 4 years ago. I mean, it'll come as a devastating blow if Trump was to somehow eke out another 4 years. In terms of the future of the Never Trumpers, I mean, I think that's still up in the air. And as I said, a number of them have already left the Republican Party. You know, George Will, I think the day after he didn't even make it to the election. I think it was the day after Paul Ryan announced his his endorsement of Trump. And Paul Ryan actually held out for a very long time and was one of the last lingering hopes of the Never Trumpers that, maybe he could be part of the resistance. And so a lot of them have left the party already. But again, one of the things that we feel like would have been a better use of energy for the Never Trumpers would have been to fight for the soul of the Republican Party. And the way in which that might have happened and still could would be to think about forming an organized faction within the party. And over the course of American history, it's been very normal to have organized, coherent factions within the two major parties. And I think that reflects a desire that's out there in the country to have more than just two options, right? We essentially only have two options. There are the libertarians and the Greens and whatever, but they can't actually win any seats, right? And because of the structure of our party system and our institutions, it's just so biased towards two parties. And, if we lived in a different country, it would be very sensible and reasonable to think about forming a third party in this kind of a situation. But again, the odds are just so stacked against that. And the way we've typically dealt with that in the United States is that we have organized factions within the parties. And, it was not that long ago. I mean, it's been decades now, but there was a liberal to moderate faction within the Republican Party based in the Northeast, especially around Nelson Rockefeller, but there was also kind of a West Coast variation with Mark Hatfield over in Oregon and a number of other figures. That was not the dominant faction, but it was there. Similarly, Democrats, I think more well known, had a very conservative Southern faction, and then kind of the mainstream. And it does seem to me that the opportunity is there for a return to real factions. You can actually see that playing out a little bit more clearly, I think, within the Democratic Party right now with the rise of Democratic Socialists and all the activity around Bernie Sanders and AOC and all the rest. They're kind of already down that road. I mean, they're fielding candidates to primary, the establishment Democrats and everything like that. And it does seem to us that there is a path for something like that in the Republican Party, and it wouldn't be the minority, or it wouldn't be the majority faction. It would be a minority faction, but it could be quite competitive in some of these places where a Trumpy Republican Party is just an absolute non-starter. And we see examples of that already. There's Charlie Baker, the governor of Massachusetts, a Republican, very popular in his second term. There's the governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, again, very popular, second term Republican governor. The Republican governor of Vermont is about to get reelected. And so these kinds of figures out there who aren't Trumpy, but who kind of position themselves as being the kind of people who provide some adult supervision for very lefty legislatures, that's a type of brand that if a group within the Republican Party actually tried to create that brand in the way that the Democratic Leadership Council did back in the 90s, that ultimately led to Clinton's rise, Bill Clinton's rise, that's something that could have some currency out there. And we do feel like it's maybe been a missed opportunity for these Never Trumpers to have not engaged in that. And there's a reason why they haven't. It's hard. It's hard, and it takes a lot of just gritty, grimy work that a lot of moderates, I think, by disposition, don't like to do. But in any event, we do still think that's a viable possibility for the Never Trumpers or some segment of the Republican Party to try to take on and form a kind of counter source of power within the party. And we at least think that would be a good, healthy thing, not only for the Republican Party, but for American democracy.
And you're addressing a lot of the questions we have here, a lot of questions about party. From another John, what is the Lincoln Project endgame? New party, restate Republican Party, potential discord between Trump rank and file and political elite. Are the gatekeepers of political parties gone forever? Let's see. Let me ask you one question from a Facebook viewer. When you talk a bit about the soul of the Republican Party, in your book, someone says that to buy into Trump, you have to believe that the essence of what the Republican Party stood for, personal responsibility, embracing of legal immigration, character counts, strong on Russia, you have to believe that all of that was just a marketing slogan and didn't mean anything. What does the Republican Party stand for? This Facebook viewer wants to know.
Right. Well, that's a good question. So that quote he's bringing up is from Stuart Stevens, who has his own book out called, I think it was All a Lie. I think that's the title of the book, so something to that effect. And Stuart Stevens is one of these kind of A-list political consultants. He's the guy who ran Mitt Romney's campaign in 2012, for instance. You know, in terms of what does it mean to be a Republican? I know Bob knows this article because he and I have talked about it. But there was a great piece by Tim Alberta in Politico a couple weeks ago where he explores that. And you know, as Stuart Stevens and as Tim Alberta, who's just one of the great journalists covering the Republican Party and the conservative movement, it's not clear anymore. You know, it used to be, as Stuart lays out, as we quote him in the book, you know, it was very clear. It's, you know, kind of personal responsibility, free trade, strong on Russia. He goes through a litany of things. And it's not clear that it's an ideas-based party anymore. And I think what has been a surprise to certainly a lot of never Trumpers, but also a lot of people like me, is how open the Republican base was to just ditching all that, right? That really wasn't what kept them in the party. You know, it's worth maybe pointing out that you know, a lot of people who used to consider themselves Republicans do not anymore. And so they don't turn up in these surveys that you know, indicate, you know, a very high level of support for Trump. You know, that's among people who claim to be Republicans. Well, that doesn't count the people who thought of themselves as Republicans back in 2015 and no longer do. But I think that's going to be a challenge for the Republican Party moving forward. There are some interesting people working on that problem. There's this group known as the Reformicons, kind of an intellectual, policy, nerdy kind of group, but associated with people like Ross Douthat at the New York Times, and David Frum too, Reihan Salam and Yuval Levin, these figures who are well known in kind of wonky Republican circles. But they have an idea, and this is somewhat in tension with that idea of diversifying the party, the autopsy theory that I was talking about before. But they have this idea basically that the party needs to recognize that the old Reagan era solutions don't work anymore. Tax cuts for the rich, that doesn't work anymore. We need to focus on, they would say, our actual voters, who increasingly are working class. And also middle class, you know, families, make it easier for working families with kids, this kind of thing, you know, child tax credits, all of that. But right now, I mean, it's hard to say that ideas or policy of any sort really has much purchase in the Republican Party. I mean, just look at this particular presidential campaign. It's hard to identify policies, right, that are part of the discussion, right? This isn't a policy-based campaign, and that's very unusual. There's usually at least talk of policy, right? And whether or not that ultimately is the thing that decides votes or not, that's always debatable. But at least there are some policies you can point to as being on the table, a legitimate part of the discourse around an election, and that's not really there on the Republican side.
So let me bring up a couple questions related to the autopsy, and then I want to get to this question on Congress. So Nicholas asked, do you think the Crystal Fromm types were more driven away by the race-baiting dog whistling in and of itself, or just how upfront Trump was with it? A Facebook question talks about how the autopsy referred to the need to have aggressive outreach to new demographic groups that the party had struggled with, but was going hard after white voters, coming at the cost of the party's ability to appeal to a diversifying electorate in the future. Then they also reference your comments on George H.W. Bush describing immigrants as honorable, decent, family-loving people, Reagan wanting to open up the border both ways. So can you talk a little bit about these issues of demographics and race and the future of the Republican Party?
Right. So yeah, those are good questions. And, I will say, one thing that came up quite a bit is that we talk to these people and they'd give some version of this story. Like they would say, look, we recognize that there's a monster in the basement, but we thought that we had the monster contained, right? And the monster being a metaphor for racist voters and so on. And they'd say, look, we knew there was this monster in the basement, but we had the monster contained. And, maybe every once in a while in the heat of a campaign or something, the monster would get let out for, a day or two, but we had a chain on the monster. We had the monster under control. And then after the election was over, we put the monster away. And they didn't realize that the monster had gotten out and that they didn't really control the monster. But that was kind of an acknowledgement that that they recognized on some level that those elements were at work in the Republican Party and within the Republican Party base, and that they failed to recognize that was a bigger deal than they thought. Eric Edelman, who's kind of one of these longtime Republican leading figures in the foreign policy world, served in most of the recent Republican administrations. He recounted his boss George W. Bush saying something to the effect of, you don't have to scratch too far below the surface before you run up against racism and xenophobia and all the rest in our party. And my job, Bush said, my job as party leader is to tamp that down. And so there was, and I think especially with the benefit of hindsight, there is a recognition that was there and that a lot of these people had failed to recognize how prominent it was. Another thing I would say, though, is that it's a reality, it's an undeniable reality that a huge portion of the Never Trumpers are based in Washington, D.C., inside the Beltway, and in New York, and on the Acela corridor, and so they are insulated. They were insulated from a lot of that, and it was easy to miss, easy to ignore if your world is kind of inside the Beltway and you go from this think tank to that think tank, which are all within walking distance. It's a very tight, insular little thing. It's possible to miss that. And I would also note that, especially in the public intellectual world, a lot of the Never Trumpers came out of places like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and these basically elite liberal institutions in which their role was to communicate, to explain to people what conservatism is, and to make the case that conservatism is a legitimate thing that belongs as a respectable outlook, next to mainstream liberalism and progressivism and whatever else there might be. And that part of their job was to explain, and it was more than their job. This was not just what they got paid to do. I mean, this was their outlook and their understanding on these things. That part of it was, if you're David Brooks at the New York Times or George Will, is to explain, no, it's not true what all the liberals say, that Republicans are just a bunch of racists. It's not true, and let me explain this. And so their whole way of operating in the world was to try to make the case that that's not what conservatism is. And so I think, if that's the world from which you come from, it's very easy to have missed a lot of that. And David Brooks is one of the people who spoke to us about that, and we quote him at length on that in the book. And I just remember him. I remember him being like literally about the last person to recognize that Trump had a chance to get the nomination and to win. I mean, Trump was nearly marching down Pennsylvania Avenue on Inauguration Day, and Brooks was still suspicious that it was possible. And he said, I got too comfortable in my routine. It's very hard, he said, as a conservative to feel besieged when your life is hanging out in Northwest Washington and teaching a class once a week at Yale and hanging out in Manhattan all the time. And so he says he's spent much of the last several years traveling the country and trying to get more in touch to see what it is that he missed. And a number of people had their own version of that kind of story. And Deena, did I miss? Feel like that was a multi-pronged question. I may have missed a piece or two, but.
No, I think that's great. And, I'll recall that you actually brought David Brooks here to Missoula. And one of his goals was to speak to Montanans to see what he was missing. So,
yep.
Well, I do want to get back to the more establishment questions, but this follows really well. Clem asks, do you think there's a connection between the demise or fading of the gatekeeping and agenda setting function of political elites and the same phenomenon in the news media?
That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess that concerns me as well. Just the latest little episode of this. I mean, Deena and I've been talking about the latest issue at the Missoulian over the weekend, and one of the things. The endorsement they had was very controversial in the Public Service Commission, and they retracted it, and it's kind of an embarrassment, and a lot of people were upset about that, and canceling subscriptions, and yanking advertising, which I understand the impulse to do that. I, at the same time, though, really worry about the state of local journalism, non-elite. New York Times is doing great, Washington Post is doing well, but I worry a lot about the state of journalism at the state and local level. So I don't have any great solution for that. But it is that is an interesting mirror image of what's happened in the political parties, and I have my own thoughts about how you could reform that, but I'm afraid they wouldn't go over very well. The genie is kind of out of the bottle. But it is instructive, how starting in 1972, our parties, led by the Democratic Party, basically turned over the nominations to the people. And in fact, it's only moved in that direction. In fact, even after Donald Trump won the Republican nomination, Democrats slashed the number of superdelegates, which was kind of the last hold that the party leaders had on the nominating process. And the reality is, if we operated under the old rules of the pre-1972 rules, there is no chance, zero chance that Donald Trump ever could have gotten a major party nomination. Just never would have happened. And it's also maybe instructive to note that if you want to like look comparatively at other countries don't do it the way we do, right? You know, the smoke-filled rooms and the party bosses get a bad rap, you know, for totally reasonable and understandable reasons. But we've shifted awfully far away from the party leaders. The party leaders, in many cases, don't have much control over the parties. So these things have certainly happened at the same time. You know, political parties getting weaker, kind of mainstream establishment journalism getting weaker. That is a very interesting parallel, and both of those things are problems, I think, that American democracy will have to grapple with.
There is a flood of questions, and we're going to wrap up pretty soon. I just want to ask you two more questions, one about Congress and then one by Diane, bringing it back to Montana. So Jeff asks, how much of the rise of Donald Trump can be attributed to the GOP leaders in Congress? How have their challenges to procedural norms eroded the nation's political culture and so created the space where someone so untraditional as Donald Trump to emerge to take power?
You know, back in 2016, there was an enormous amount of resistance to Trump. And I mentioned Paul Ryan earlier, you know, he was certainly, I mean, for a lot of reasons, you know, he was a lot of the Never Trump types used to love Paul Ryan and were deeply, deeply disappointed when he finally came out in support of Trump. You know, he'd been kind of the golden boy, the policy wonk, the guy who, it was the whole package. He had the media savvy and everything. So, you know, I think back then, a lot of the leadership in Congress, I mean, these are some of the party leaders. You know, they were opposed, but they either kept quiet or they changed, right? Lindsey Graham is a great example of this. He had some great lines back in 2016. He was a candidate too, but he had some great lines, I remember, about comparing Trump and Ted Cruz. And he was saying, like, yeah, you know, it's like shooting yourself in the head or drinking poison. And he said he was going to take Cruz, which he equated to drinking poison rather than shooting yourself in the head, because there's a chance that there will be an antidote if you drink the poison. And of course now he's one of the president's strongest supporters and enablers and all the rest.
And
so
he's featured in a Lincoln Project video. Lindsey.
Oh yeah. The Lincoln Project is all over Lindsey Graham, and they've cited Steve Daines a couple times too. But so I think over time, you know, once he became president, I mean, another huge disappointment. I mean, in a way that the Never Trump experience, at least until very recently, has been just a litany of disappointments. But it was disappointing as kind of one by one, these people who they thought were in their corner started changing their stripes. And I mean, you talk to the Never Trump people, and they'll tell you, like, look, we talk with these guys when the cameras are off, and they hate Trump, but they won't say it because that's where the power lies. And so I think there's a huge amount of revulsion, and in fact, it's, for some of them, it's even greater than the contempt they have for Trump himself. It's these people who they see as giving cover to him. You know, they say, look, Trump's a narcissist, a sociopath. That is who he is. But some of these other people know better, and it's sad to see them supporting that and doing damage, in certainly from the Never Trump perspective, to the norms of American democracy.
Well, I want to thank everyone for putting so many great questions in. I'm sorry that this is going to be our last one and we weren't able to get to so many of them, but this is from Diane. Rural states like Montana are heavily dependent on federal subsidies for rural healthcare, broadband, farming, or airports, etc. Since Trump Republicans have vigorously disparaged American cities that pay far higher in taxes than they receive in return, what do you believe the effect of such disparagement might have on continued rural support?
You broke up a little bit, just that last sentence there, Deena.
Sorry. Okay, since Trump Republicans have vigorously disparaged American cities that pay far higher in taxes than they receive in return, what do you believe the effect of such disparagement might have on continued rural support?
Yeah, well, I mean, you think about it from the Montana context. I mean, this is a Trump state. He won by 20 last time, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in states like Montana, not just Montana, about some of those figures. The amount of money we send back to Washington versus the amount of money that's kicked back to us. And yeah, I mean, I think that is an area of concern for sure. And to the extent that Montana trends increasingly Republican, as I think has been a trend basically, since some of these leading Democratic figures in the state, like Max Baucus and Pat Williams, since they've departed the scene, when Democrats are winning statewide here, it is a real nail biter. They eke it out. And there's definitely a chance that some of the Democrats could again this time, probably most notably Steve Bullock, who does seem to have a real fighting chance in this one. But if he does, it's going to be close. When Republicans win statewide in this state, they are typically winning by large margins, oftentimes over 10 percentage points. And that I think is a legitimate concern. There's a real feeling out there on the left in this country, I think, that's kind of waking up to some of those statistics that questioner asked about. Like, we kind of seem to be coming out on the short end of the stick here, and not only about how much money we pay in taxes versus how much we get back, but you could cite other things, just some of the structural things of our political system. The Electoral College is heavily weighted to rural states, which are currently in the Republican camp. That hasn't always been the case, but they are now. And the court packing thing, the filibuster, the Senate as an institution, all of these things. And so, if I'm understanding the question right, I mean, I think those are things to be worried about for a state like Montana, that there could be a reaction against the way things are currently set up that work pretty darn well for a rural, relatively poor state like Montana.
Well, Rob, I want to thank you. This has been a fascinating discussion. We're grateful for your expertise. We're grateful for your upcoming leadership of the Mansfield program in ethics and public affairs. So I want to also thank Dane Scott again for all the work he's done to lay the groundwork for a successful ethics program here in the state of Montana. To thank Sue and Bob Brown for lending their names to a scholarship that will benefit students for decades to come. To the anonymous donors who recognized their commitment to public service and made that award possible to the students. And finally, thanks to all of you and for caring enough to join us this evening for engaging in a vigorous discussion. Our next dialogue is a week from tonight, where we'll be hosting Jim Messina for an insider look at what's happening with our election. So thank you all and good night.